Hello, everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. 1. The Revolutionary War Soldier of Pennsylvania Mountains. I've been driving these Pennsylvania mountain roads for over 15 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the highways could throw at me. Weather, wildlife, mechanical breakdowns, you name it, I've dealt with it. But what happened that October night near Loyalsack Creek still gives me chills, and I'm honestly not sure how to explain it. It was well past midnight, somewhere around 2 a.m., and I was hauling furniture from Scranton to Pittsburgh. The autumn mist hung low over the mountains, creating that ethereal atmosphere you get in these old hills. Route 6 wound ahead of me like a dark ribbon, illuminated only by my headlights cutting through the fog. The radio had faded to static hours ago, leaving me alone with the diesel engine's steady hum and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. I know every curve on this route, every steep grade where you need to downshift, every spot where fog gathers in the valleys. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify. The air itself seemed to hold secrets from centuries past. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend near the old creek, my headlights swept across the tree line ahead. That's when I saw him. Standing perfectly still at the edge of the forest was a figure that made my heart skip several beats. A man in what appeared to be a Revolutionary War uniform stood motionless, a long musket held at his side. I slowed my truck, squinting through the windshield to make sure I wasn't seeing things. The figure stood perhaps 50 yards away, but I could see him with startling clarity. His coat was deep blue with brass buttons that caught my headlights, and a tricorn hat sat squarely on his head. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes fixed directly on my approaching truck with an intensity that sent chills racing down my spine. Here's where things get really strange. The temperature in my cab began dropping noticeably. My breath started fogging up, and I reached for the heater controls, but they were already cranked to maximum. Outside, frost began forming on the edges of my windshield. Despite the relatively mild October night, the cold seemed to seep through the very metal of my truck, settling into my bones with an otherworldly chill that no amount of heat could touch. As I watched, completely transfixed, the Revolutionary War soldier began to move. He turned slowly, deliberately, and started walking toward the trees with measured, purposeful steps. His movements were fluid, yet somehow wrong, like he was walking through water rather than air. The musket remained at his side, and his gaze never wavered from my truck until the very last moment. I pulled my rig to a complete stop, engine idling roughly in the sudden cold. I watched as the figure approached the tree line, expecting to see him disappear into the forest shadows. But instead, something far more unsettling occurred. Just as the soldier reached the first line of pine trees, he simply vanished. Not behind the trees, not into the shadows, but gone entirely, as if he had never existed at all. The supernatural cold intensified for several more moments, making my teeth chatter uncontrollably despite my heavy jacket. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the chill lifted. My heater began working again, and the frost on my windshield melted away like morning dew. I sat there for a long time, engine running, staring at the spot where the soldier had stood. I'd heard the local stories, of course. These mountains saw their share of Revolutionary War battles, and legends speak of Continental soldiers who died far from home, their spirits still wandering the ancient paths through the wilderness. I'd always dismissed such tales as tourist folklore, stories told around campfires to entertain visitors. But now, as I finally put my truck back in gear and continued down the dark mountain road, I found myself thinking about those long-ago battles, young men who had fought and died for an idea of freedom in these very hills. The soldier I'd seen looked so real, so substantial, yet there had been something eternal about him, something that spoke of duty, transcending death itself. For the rest of my journey through the Pennsylvania mountains, I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but my mind wandered to that pale, determined face beneath the tricorn hat. I wondered if he was still out there, standing guard over some forgotten battlefield, waiting for orders that would never come, or perhaps watching over travelers who passed through his eternal domain. Was it exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road? I've considered these explanations, turned them over in my head countless times, but the physical evidence, the sudden bone-deep cold, the frost on my windshield, the way my heater stopped working, suggests something beyond mere imagination. As dawn finally broke over the eastern ridges that morning, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, I felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over me. Whatever I had encountered in the darkness hadn't felt malevolent or threatening. Instead, there had been something almost protective about the soldier's presence, as if he were a guardian spirit watching over these ancient roads. I never saw the Revolutionary War soldier again, but I often think about him during my nighttime runs through the Pennsylvania mountains. Sometimes, when the mist hangs particularly low and the temperature drops unexpectedly in my cab, I nod respectfully toward the tree line and whisper a quiet thank you to the spirit who watches over travelers in the night, to the woman in the wedding dress. There are some sights you see on the road that stay with you forever, burned into your memory like a brand. What happened on that hill road outside Millfield is one of those experiences, something that challenges everything you think you know about reality. It was nearly 2 a.m, and I was making my usual run from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. The old 2-lane highway was my preferred shortcut, winding through rural countryside where farmhouses sat dark and sleeping, their windows like closed eyes in the peaceful night. I'd been driving trucks for 23 years at that point, and I prided myself on staying alert during those long, lonely hours of darkness. The road ahead curved gently upward toward a substantial hill, one I'd climbed hundreds of times before. Classic country played softly on the radio, and I sipped coffee from my thermos to ward off fatigue. Everything was routine, normal, until my headlights swept across the crest of that hill. There, just beyond the peak, an orange van lay overturned on its side, wheels pointing toward the star-filled sky. The vehicle looked like it had rolled several times before coming to rest, its metal body crumpled and torn in ways that spoke of tremendous impact. Glass sparkled like deadly diamonds across the asphalt. But it wasn't the wrecked van that made my blood run cold and my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Standing beside the overturned vehicle was a woman in what appeared to be a wedding dress. Even from a distance, I could see that the once white gown was stained dark with what looked unmistakably like blood. The woman stood perfectly still, facing away from my approaching truck, her long veil moving gently in the night breeze like a ghostly flag. My training kicked in immediately. I'd been first on the scene of accidents before, and I knew that every second counted when someone was injured. I pulled my truck to the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, and reached for my CB radio with shaking hands to call for emergency services. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the static as I gave my location, reporting a rollover accident with at least one apparent injury. Grabbing my emergency flashlight and first aid kit, I climbed down from my cab and jogged toward the scene. The asphalt was surprisingly quiet under my boots, and I noticed immediately that there was no smell of gasoline or burning oil that usually accompanied such violent accidents. The night air was still and strangely peaceful, filled only with the distant sound of crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves in nearby trees. "Ma'am," I called out as I approached, my voice echoing strangely in the quiet darkness. "Are you hurt? I've called for help, and an ambulance is on the way." The woman didn't respond or turn around. She continued to stand motionless beside the overturned van, her blood-stained dress moving slightly in the breeze like something from a nightmare. My flashlight beam played across the scene as I drew closer, and details began to emerge that made my skin crawl. The van appeared severely damaged, its windows shattered and roof caved in from multiple rolls. Strange shadows seemed to dance around the wreckage in ways that defied the steady beam of my light. The woman's stillness was becoming increasingly unsettling. No injured person stands that perfectly motionless. "Miss," I tried again, my voice carrying a note of growing concern. "Can you hear me? I'm here to help." I was perhaps 20 feet away now, close enough to see that the woman's dark hair was partially covered by the blood-stained veil, close enough to notice that she seemed unusually pale in my flashlight beam. Not just pale, but almost luminescent. That's when I decided to return to my truck to get a blanket for shock treatment. Something about the scene felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. As I jogged back to my rig, I kept glancing over my shoulder at the motionless figure. The emergency responders would be here soon, and they'd have better equipment for dealing with trauma victims. I grabbed a clean blanket from my sleeper and turned back toward the accident scene, already planning how to approach the injured woman without startling her further. But when I looked back toward the overturned van, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The hill road stretched before me, empty and dark. No overturned van, no woman in a wedding dress, no wreckage, no glass, no evidence that anything had ever happened there at all. Just an empty stretch of asphalt gleaming wetly under my truck's headlights, as normal and peaceful as any other night. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, flashlights sweeping back and forth across the road where I had clearly seen the accident. The pavement showed no skid marks, no debris, no signs of impact. It was as if the entire scene had been a hallucination, except for one troubling detail. The emergency dispatcher was still waiting for my update on the CB radio. I returned to my truck with legs that felt like rubber, picked up the microphone with trembling hands, and reported that there was no accident at my location. The dispatcher sounded confused. I'd been quite specific about what I'd seen. I mumbled something about shadows playing tricks and signed off. But I knew what I had witnessed was far more than optical illusion. Was it fatigue-induced hallucination? A stress reaction from too many real accidents I'd witnessed over the years? I've considered every rational explanation, but the vivid details remain crystal clear in my memory. The blood on white satin, the unnatural stillness, the way her veil moved in air that felt charged with otherworldly energy. Local research later revealed that stretch of road has a history. Multiple fatal accidents over the decades, including at least 2 involving wedding parties traveling to or from ceremonies. I wonder sometimes if what I saw was an echo of tragedy, a moment when the boundary between past and present became thin enough for something to slip through. I still drive that hill road regularly, but I approach that particular crest with a mixture of dread and respect. Sometimes, when conditions are just right, misty night, around 2 a.m., when the world feels suspended between sleeping and waking, I slow down and scan the roadside carefully. I'm not sure I want to see her again, but part of me feels like a witness to something important, something that deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. 3. The Pale Lady with Baby Halloween Night brings out the strange in people. But what I encountered that October 31st on Interstate 80 was something that still defies explanation. I've hauled freight across this country for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen every kind of oddball the highways could produce. But sometimes the universe serves up something that challenges everything you believe about reality. I was running a late load from Chicago to Cleveland, making good time despite the holiday traffic. The interstate stretched ahead like a dark river under the star-filled sky, and I was settling into that meditative rhythm long-haul drivers know well. The CB radio chattered occasionally with other truckers reporting their positions and sharing road conditions, but mostly it was just me, my diesel engine, and the endless ribbon of asphalt. Around 11 p.m., about 50 miles outside of Toledo, my headlights caught something that made me do a double take. Walking along the shoulder of the interstate, moving in the same direction as traffic, was a woman in a white dress. She appeared to be carrying something in her arms, something small and precious that she held close to her chest. My first thought was practical concern. No one walks on the interstate at night, especially not dressed like she was. The white dress looked formal, almost vintage in style, and completely inappropriate for hiking along a busy highway. As I drew closer, I could see that she was carrying what appeared to be a baby, wrapped in a light-colored blanket. I started slowing down immediately, activating my hazard lights and reaching for the CB to report a pedestrian on the interstate. The woman seemed oblivious to the traffic, walking with steady, measured steps along the narrow shoulder. As my headlights illuminated her more clearly, details emerged that made my skin crawl. She was extraordinarily pale, not just fair-skinned, but white as fresh snow, almost luminescent in the artificial light. Her dark hair hung long and straight, and her white dress appeared to be from another era entirely, with long sleeves and a high neckline that spoke of decades past. But it was her eyes that really got to me. When she turned to look at my approaching truck, her eyes reflected the light like an animal's. But there was something deeply human and deeply sad in that gaze. She wasn't looking at me with fear or surprise, but with a kind of resigned patience, as if she'd been expecting me to stop. I pulled my rig to the shoulder, about 50 yards ahead of her, hazard lights flashing, and climbed down from my cab. The October night was crisp but not cold, yet I found myself shivering as I walked back toward her. There was something about the atmosphere that felt charged, electric, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Ma'am," I called out, keeping my voice gentle and non-threatening. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman had stopped walking, when my truck pulled over, and now she stood perfectly still, cradling what I could now clearly see was indeed a baby. The infant appeared to be sleeping peacefully, its tiny face barely visible beneath the pale blanket. She didn't respond to my question, but she didn't seem afraid either. "Wait," I called after her, genuine concern driving me to follow. "You can't go into the woods with a baby." But despite her seemingly slow, deliberate movements, I couldn't seem to close the distance between us. The woman in white continued her inexorable march toward the dark woods, never looking back, never acknowledging my calls. Close enough to see the intricate details of her vintage dress, close enough to notice that her feet seemed to barely touch the ground. That's when she simply vanished. Not gradually, not behind trees or into shadows, but gone entirely, as if she had never existed at all. One moment she was there, white dress glowing in the darkness, baby cradled safely in her arms. The next moment, I was staring at empty forest, calling out to nobody, feeling foolish and frightened in equal measure. I stood there for a long time, flashlight sweeping back and forth across the tree line, looking for any sign of where they might have gone. The woods were dense, but not impenetrable, and there should have been some indication of their passage. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, something. But the forest was pristine, undisturbed, as if no one had ever walked there. The rational part of my mind immediately began working through explanations. Fatigue, highway hypnosis, stress-induced hallucination, all reasonable possibilities for someone who'd been driving for 12 hours straight. But the experience had felt so real, so vivid, that dismissing it as mere imagination seemed almost insulting to what I'd witnessed. I returned to my truck and tried to focus on finishing my run to Cleveland, but my mind kept drifting back to the pale woman and her baby. There had been something timeless about her, something that spoke of tragedy and loss. The way she'd carried that infant with such tender protection suggested a love that transcended ordinary understanding. Research later revealed that stretch of Interstate 80 was built over much older roads, including historic routes used by settlers moving west in the 1800s. Local historical societies have records of various tragedies. Families separated by illness, mothers and children lost to harsh winters. Stories of loss that echo across generations. Was what I saw some kind of residual haunting, a moment from the past replaying itself on a night when the veil between worlds grows thin? Or was it something more personal, a spirit still trying to protect her child, still walking an eternal journey toward some destination she can never reach? I've driven that same stretch of I-80 many times since that Halloween night, and I always slow down near that particular wooded area. Sometimes, especially on misty nights when visibility is poor, I find myself scanning the shoulder carefully, looking for a figure in white, carrying something precious. Part of me hopes never to see her again. The encounter left me deeply unsettled, questioning things I thought I understood about life and death. But another part of me feels honored to have witnessed something so profound, so full of love and loss. If she is still out there, still walking her eternal path, I hope she finds the peace she's seeking. For Montana Highway Phantom. The high plains of Montana stretch endlessly under a sky so vast it makes you feel like an ant crawling across infinity. I've been running freight through this country for 15 years, and I never get tired of the sheer scope of it all. But there's something about these lonely highways that attracts the unusual, the unexplained, the downright mysterious. What happened near Lavina on Highway 12? was one of those encounters that makes you question everything you think you know about reality. It was late spring, around 1 a.m., and I was hauling agricultural equipment from Billings to Glasgow. The night was clear and cold, with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. My CB was quiet, not much traffic out here in the middle of nowhere. The Lavina turnoff is just a small highway sign marking a dirt road that leads to what's left of a town that never quite made it. Most people blow right past it without a second thought. But as my headlights swept across that familiar green sign, I saw something that made me instinctively slow down. Standing next to the highway sign was a young woman, maybe 18 or 19 years old. She was wearing clothes that immediately caught my attention, not because they were unusual, but because they were so specifically from another time. Bell-bottom jeans, a peasant blouse with flowing sleeves, and a headband holding back long, straight hair parted in the middle. Everything about her screamed 1970s, from her platform shoes to the purse hanging from her shoulder. She wasn't trying to flag me down or stick out her thumb. Instead, she stood perfectly still beside the sign, facing the highway as if she was waiting for something specific. There was something patient about her posture, something that suggested she'd been waiting for a very long time. The Montana night air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and distant snow from the mountains. "You okay out here, miss?" I called out. "It's pretty isolated. Do you need a ride somewhere?" She turned to look at me then, and I got my first clear view of her face. She was pretty in that natural, unadorned way that was popular in the 70s. No makeup, just clear skin and bright eyes that seemed to hold depths of sadness. When she smiled at me, it was gentle, but somehow resigned, as if she appreciated the offer, but knew it wouldn't work out. "That's very kind of you," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the distance between us, despite speaking in normal tones. "But I'm waiting for someone specific." She gestured vaguely toward the empty highway stretching in both directions. "He'll be along soon." Something about her response bothered me, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. Maybe it was the way she seemed so certain about someone coming, despite the fact that we hadn't seen another vehicle for the past hour. Or maybe it was how she seemed completely comfortable standing alone on a desolate highway in the middle of the night, dressed like she was heading to a folk music festival from 50 years ago. "Are you sure?" I pressed, genuine concern overriding my usual respect for people's privacy. "It's going to be a long wait out here. The next town is 30 miles, and there's not much traffic this time of night." I glanced at my dashboard clock, 1:15 a.m. "Why don't you let me give you a lift to Glasgow, or at least to a gas station where you can call someone?" She shook her head, still smiling, that patient, sad smile. "Thank you, but no, I need to wait here." She looked back toward the highway sign, then added, "He promised he'd come back for me. It's just taking longer than expected." There was something about the way she said it that sent chills down my spine. Not the words themselves, but the tone. Like she was talking about waiting for someone who was already years overdue. I found myself studying her appearance more carefully, trying to figure out what seemed so off about the whole situation. Her clothes weren't just vintage styled. They looked authentically aged, as if they'd been worn regularly for decades. The denim had that particular fade pattern you only get from years of actual wear, and the peasant blouse had tiny repairs that spoke of careful maintenance over time. "Miss," I said, leaning farther out my window, "what year do you think it is?" She looked at me with confusion, as if it was an odd question. 1975. she said without hesitation. Why? The hair on my arms stood up. I was suddenly very aware of the vast emptiness surrounding us, the way the stars seemed to be watching our conversation with ancient eyes. "What's your name?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Jennifer," she replied, still smiling that gentle, trusting smile. "Jennifer Walsh. I'm waiting for my boyfriend Tommy. He went to get gas for his car, and he said he'd be right back. That was ... double quotes. She paused, looking uncertain for the first time. That was a little while ago. My mouth went dry. The 1970s were 50 years ago. If this girl was real, if she was who she claimed to be, then something was very, very wrong with this picture. But she looked so solid, so present, so undeniably there, that I couldn't dismiss her as a hallucination. "Jennifer," I said carefully, "I think maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding. It's not 1975 anymore. It's 2025. You've been waiting here for a very long time." She stared at me for a moment, and I watched as confusion flickered across her features. Then she looked around, really looked, at my modern truck with its GPS display and LED headlights, at the updated highway signage, at details that hadn't existed in her time. "That's not possible," she whispered, but her voice carried less certainty now. "Tommy said he'd be right back. He wouldn't leave me here. He loves me." Not disappear suddenly, but grow translucent, like morning mist touched by sunlight. Her 1970s clothes became see-through. Her face grew pale and insubstantial, and within moments she was gone entirely. I sat there in my idling truck for a long time, staring at the spot where she'd stood. The Lavina turn-off sign stood alone in my headlights, just a piece of metal marking a dirt road to nowhere, showing no evidence that anyone had ever been there. Research later revealed that in July 1975, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh had indeed disappeared near Lavina. She'd been traveling with her boyfriend when their car ran out of gas. He'd walked to get help and never returned. His body was found 3 days later, victim of a heart attack brought on by the heat and exertion. Jennifer was never found, despite extensive searches. I think about her sometimes, standing by that lonely highway sign, still waiting for someone who will never come, still believing it's 1975, still trusting that love is stronger than death or time. There's something both heartbreaking and beautiful about that kind of faith, even when it's misplaced. I've driven past that turnoff dozens of times since then, and I always slow down, always look carefully at the spot where she stood. Part of me hopes to see her again, to somehow help her understand that she can stop waiting now. But another part of me thinks maybe it's better this way. Maybe hope, even false hope, is better than the alternative. 5. Pennsylvania Mountain Hitchhiker. The back roads of Pennsylvania's mountains hold secrets that go back centuries, and some of those secrets still walk among us. What happened on that remote stretch near Cross Fork was one of those encounters that stays with you forever, challenging everything you think you know about life, death, and the spaces in between. It was early November, and I was running a solo load of lumber from a mill near Gallatin to a construction site outside of Williamsport. The route took me through some of the most isolated country in Pennsylvania, winding mountain roads where you can drive for miles without seeing another soul. These are the kind of roads where cell phones don't work and GPS signals get confused by the terrain. Around 10 p.m., I was navigating a particularly narrow stretch when my headlights caught something unusual ahead. An elderly man was walking along the shoulder, moving slowly but steadily through the darkness. He was wearing all white, white pants, white shirt, white jacket, and stood out against the dark forest like a beacon. My first thought was concern. Nobody walks these mountain roads at night, especially not someone who appeared to be in his 70s or 80s. The nearest town was 15 miles in either direction, and the terrain was rough and unforgiving. I slowed down and pulled alongside him, rolling down my passenger window. "Sir," I called out, "are you okay? Do you need help?" The old man turned to look at me, and I got my first clear view of his face. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile, but something about him seemed strangely timeless, as if he could have been from any era in the past century. "That would be very kind of you, young man," he said, his voice carrying easily despite the rumble of my diesel engine. "I'm trying to get to Gallatin. My car broke down a few miles back, and I need to reach the hospital there." There was something urgent, but not panicked in his tone, and I immediately thought of family emergencies, a wife or grandchild in crisis, the kind of situation where every minute counts. I reached across and opened the passenger door. "Climb on up. Charleston's about 40 miles ahead. I can get you there, no problem." She settled into the seat beside me, and we pulled back onto the highway. For the first few miles, everything seemed normal. She made polite conversation about the weather and thanked me repeatedly for the kindness. But as we wound deeper into the mountains, I began to notice things that made my skin crawl. The temperature in the cab was dropping steadily, despite my heater running full blast. My breath started to fog, and I could see hers as well. Strange for a relatively mild October night. When I glanced over at her, I noticed that her dress, which had looked faded but normal in my headlights, now appeared to be from much earlier than I'd first thought. The style was definitely 1950s, maybe even 1940s. "How long were you waiting out there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Something about the situation was beginning to feel very wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. "Oh, quite a while," she replied, but her voice sounded different now, more distant, echoing strangely in the confines of the cab. "Time has a way of ... stretching out when you're waiting for help." That's when I noticed we were approaching one of the turnpike's most dangerous curves, a sharp left turn with a steep drop-off on the right side. I'd navigated it hundreds of times, always slowing down and using engine braking to maintain control. But as I began to slow down, something impossible happened. The woman beside me began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, like a photograph left in sunlight. I could see through her to the passenger door, could watch the mountain scenery pass through her translucent form. But worse than her fading appearance was what she did next. She reached across and grabbed the steering wheel. Her touch was ice cold, and despite her ethereal appearance, her grip was strong enough to jerk the truck toward the guardrail. I fought to maintain control, but it was like wrestling with winter itself, cold, implacable, and terrifyingly powerful. "Let go," I shouted, using both hands to pull the wheel back to the left, away from the drop-off that would have sent my truck tumbling hundreds of feet down the mountainside. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer. In fact, she was no longer really there at all, just a suggestion of movement. A cold presence that continued to fight me for control of the vehicle. The truck skidded sideways, tires screaming against asphalt, as I desperately tried to counter her invisible interference. I managed to regain control just as we exited the curve, but the effort left me shaking and gasping. When I looked over at the passenger seat, it was empty. No woman, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Just the lingering cold and the memory of fingers like ice trying to send me over the edge. I pulled over at the next rest area and sat there for nearly an hour, trying to process what had happened. The rational explanation was that I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the entire encounter. But the truck showed signs of the struggle. Scratches on the steering wheel where invisible fingernails had clawed for purchase, and a smell like winter air that took hours to dissipate. Over the following weeks, I made it a point to ask other drivers about their experiences on that stretch of the turnpike. What I learned chilled me to the bone. At least a dozen truckers reported similar encounters over the past few years. A woman in an old-fashioned dress who needed a ride to Charleston, who would disappear during dangerous curves, often after trying to cause an accident. Some drivers had been less fortunate than me. There were documented cases of trucks going over the guardrail on that same curve. Drivers found dead in crashes that investigators couldn't fully explain. Skid marks suggested they'd swerved suddenly, as if avoiding something or fighting for control of their vehicles. Local research revealed a tragic story from 1953. A young woman named Mary Catherine Phillips had been driving to Charleston to meet her when her car skidded off the road during a winter storm. She died on impact, and her body wasn't found for 3 days. According to newspaper accounts, her last words to a neighbor had been about how important it was to reach Charleston. Her wedding was scheduled for the following week. The theory among locals was that Mary Catherine's spirit remained trapped on the highway, still trying to complete her final journey. But something had gone wrong in death. Some twist of tragedy and unfulfilled desire that turned her from a harmless hitchhiker into something far more dangerous. I continued driving the West Virginia Turnpike for several more years, but I never picked up another hitchhiker on that stretch between Beckley and Charleston. Other drivers reported similar encounters throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s, though the sightings became less frequent as the years passed. Perhaps Mary Catherine finally found her peace, or perhaps modern traffic patterns simply made her appearances less likely. But I still remember that October night, the gradual cold, the fading dress, the desperate struggle for control as invisible hands tried to drag me toward the same fate that had claimed her decades earlier. Some spirits, it seems, are not content to rest. Some carry their tragedies with them into whatever comes after, and sometimes those tragedies spill over into the world of the living. The West Virginia Turnpike taught me that the line between life and death is thinner than we like to believe, especially on dark mountain roads where the past refuses to stay buried. 6. West Virginia Turnpike Ghost. The rain drummed steadily against the windshield as Sarah navigated the winding curves of the West Virginia Turnpike. It was well past midnight, and the stretch between Beckley and Charleston felt particularly lonely tonight. The radio crackled with static between stations, and the occasional distant flash of lightning illuminated the dark. Mountains that rose like sleeping giants on either side of the highway. Sarah had driven this route countless times during her years as a traveling nurse, but tonight felt different somehow. The familiar comfort of the well-worn asphalt seemed tinged with an inexplicable unease. She adjusted her grip on the steering wheel and tried to focus on the rhythm of the windshield wipers, a steady, hypnotic beat that usually helped her stay alert during these late-night drives. As she crested a small hill near the mossy exit, her headlights caught something unusual ahead. A figure stood at the roadside, thumb extended in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Sarah's first instinct was to keep driving. Picking up strangers on dark highways wasn't exactly safe practice, but something about the person's posture, the way they stood so still despite the pouring rain, made her ease off the accelerator. The figure was that of a young man, perhaps in his 20s, wearing what appeared to be a military-style jacket. His dark hair was plastered to his head from the rain, yet he seemed oddly calm, almost serene. As Sarah's car approached, he looked directly at her through the windshield, with eyes that seemed to reflect more light than they should have in the darkness. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself pulling over. The rational part of her mind protested, but something deeper, perhaps compassion, perhaps curiosity, compelled her to stop. The young man approached the passenger side window with measured steps, and Sarah noticed he left no wet footprints on the pavement despite standing in the downpour. "Thank you for stopping," he said, as he settled into the passenger seat, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "I'm heading toward Charleston." Sarah nodded, checking her mirrors before pulling back onto the highway. "No problem. Terrible night to be out walking." The hitchhiker smiled, a gentle, somewhat melancholy expression. "I've been walking this road for quite some time now. Sometimes folks stop, sometimes they don't. I appreciate the kindness." As they drove, Sarah found herself stealing glances at her passenger. There was something oddly timeless about him, as if he belonged to another era. His jacket, she now noticed, had military insignia that looked vintage, possibly from the 1960s. His profile was sharp and clean, almost ethereal in the dashboard's soft glow. "Are you military?" she asked, making conversation to ease the strange tension she felt building. "Was," he replied quietly. "Served my time, did my duty. Now I'm just trying to get home." The rain began to lighten as they traveled deeper into the night. The highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, bordered by towering pines and rocky outcroppings. Other than the occasional long-haul trucker heading in the opposite direction, they had the road mostly to themselves. "I used to drive this route with my father," the young man said suddenly, his voice distant. "Back when I was a boy, he'd tell me stories about these mountains, about the people who lived here before the highway was built. Said the land remembered everything, every person who walked it, every story that unfolded here." Sarah found his words oddly comforting. There was something peaceful about his presence, despite the initial unease she'd felt. The steady hum of the engine and the gentle patter of diminishing rain created a cocoon of tranquility around them. "What kind of stories?" she asked softly. "Oh, all kinds. Tales of families who carved out lives in these hills, miners who worked deep in the earth, soldiers who passed through on their way to and from distant conflicts." He said some souls get so attached to a place that they never really leave, even when their time comes to move on. Sarah glanced at her passenger again. In the dim light, he seemed almost translucent, as if he were slowly fading around the edges. She blinked hard, attributing the strange perception to fatigue and the hypnotic effect of night driving. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked, concerned by his increasingly distant demeanor. "I'm fine," he assured her, though his voice seemed to come from farther away than the passenger seat. "Just thinking about home, about how some journeys take longer than others to complete." As they approached the outskirts of Charleston, the young man grew quieter. The city lights began to twinkle in the distance, warm and welcoming after the isolation of the mountain highway. Sarah felt a strange reluctance to reach their destination. as if ending this journey would somehow break a spell that had settled over them. "Where exactly would you like me to drop you off?" she asked, as they entered the city limits. When she received no answer, Sarah turned to look at the passenger seat. It was empty. The young man had vanished as silently as he had appeared, leaving only the faintest impression in the upholstery and a sense of peaceful melancholy that lingered in the air. Sarah pulled over, her heart racing as she tried to process what had just happened. She checked the back seat, looked around the car, even stepped outside to see if he had somehow gotten out without her noticing. But the street was empty except for the occasional passing car and the distant glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Climbing back into her car, Sarah sat quietly for several minutes, trying to make sense of the experience. Had she imagined the entire encounter? Had fatigue played tricks on her mind? Yet she could still hear his voice, still remember the weight of his presence beside her. As she resumed her drive to the hospital where she was scheduled to work the next shift, Sarah found herself thinking about the young man's words about souls who remain attached to certain places. She thought about the stories her grandmother used to tell about spirits who lingered where they had unfinished business, where they had loved deeply, or where they had met their end. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself researching the history of the West Virginia Turnpike. She learned about the accidents that had occurred over the years, about the young soldiers who had traveled this route during the Vietnam era, about the construction workers who had died building the highway through these treacherous mountains. She discovered newspaper clippings from the 1960s and 70s, describing encounters remarkably similar to her own. Reports from truckers and late-night travelers who had picked up a hitchhiker matching the description of her passenger, only to have him disappear before reaching his destination. The reports always described the same gentle demeanor, the same military bearing, the same peaceful vanishing. Sarah never saw the hitchhiker again during her subsequent trips along the turnpike, though she always found herself slowing down near the spot where she had first encountered him. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the mist rolled through the mountains, she thought she caught a glimpse of a solitary figure at the roadside. But when she looked more carefully, there was never anyone there. She began to understand that some experiences transcend rational explanation, that the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the departed, might be more fluid than we typically acknowledge. The encounter had left her with a sense of connection to something larger than herself, to the history of the land, to the stories of those who had traveled this road before her, to the mysterious ways in which human compassion can bridge even the most impossible gaps. Now, as Sarah drives the turnpike on quiet nights, she carries with her the memory of that gentle presence and the peaceful lesson he had shared about the enduring nature of human kindness. She has learned that sometimes the most profound encounters are the ones that can't be fully explained, the ones that remind us that reality might be far more expansive and mysterious than we dare to imagine. And on those rare occasions when she sees another late-night traveler pulled over to help someone in need, she smiles, knowing that the spirit of compassion that defines the best of humanity continues to move along these mountain roads, connecting souls across time and circumstance in ways that will forever remain beautifully, inexplicably mysterious. 7. Texas Phantom Hitchhiker. The Texas Panhandle stretches endlessly under a sky so vast it makes you feel like you're driving across the bottom of an upside-down ocean. I've been running freight through this country for 18 years, and I never get tired of the sheer scope of it all. miles and miles of rolling prairie that seemed to go on forever, punctuated by small towns that appear and disappear like islands in a sea of grass. What happened outside Amarillo on that clear September night was one of those encounters that makes you question everything you think you know about reality. I was hauling electronic equipment from Dallas to Denver, making good time on I-40 through the heart of Texas cattle country. The night was perfect for driving. Clear skies, no wind, and traffic light enough that I could settle into that meditative rhythm long-haul drivers know well. Around 11 p.m., about 20 miles east of Amarillo, my headlights caught something unusual on the shoulder ahead. A young woman was walking along the highway, moving in the same direction as traffic, but making slow progress on foot. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with long dark hair and wearing jeans and a simple blouse, normal enough clothing. But something about her seemed different from the typical stranded motorist. I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder ahead of her, hazard lights flashing. Through my mirrors, I watched her approach the truck with measured steps. There was something graceful about the way she moved, something that suggested she was completely comfortable walking alone on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere. I rolled down my passenger window as she reached the cab. "You okay out here, miss? It's pretty isolated. Do you need a ride somewhere?" She looked up at me with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge far beyond her apparent years. "That would be wonderful," she said, her voice clear and articulate despite speaking softly. "I'm trying to get to the truck stop at Amarillo. Someone's supposed to meet me there." She climbed into the passenger seat with fluid ease, settling in as if she belonged there. As we pulled back onto the highway, I tried to make conversation. "What happened to your car?" I asked, glancing over at her in the dim light from my dashboard. Up close, she was strikingly beautiful, but there was something ethereal about her appearance, as if she wasn't quite solid, quite present in the same way other people were. "I don't have a car," she replied simply. "I was just walking, thinking about things. Sometimes you need to walk to really understand." She turned to look out the passenger window at the endless prairie rolling past under the starlight. Something about her response intrigued me. Most hitchhikers have specific, practical reasons for needing rides: car trouble, missed buses, emergency situations. But this young woman seemed to be traveling for more philosophical reasons. "What kind of things do you think about out here?" I asked, genuinely curious. The Texas Panhandle was certainly a good place for contemplation. Endless horizons that put human concerns into perspective. Skies so vast they made you feel both insignificant and part of something much larger. She was quiet for a moment, still gazing out at the star-filled darkness. "The universe," she said finally. "How everything is connected. How the same elements that make up those stars also make up us. How we're all just different arrangements of the same cosmic dust, separated by time and space, but fundamentally part of the same infinite whole." Her words sent chills down my spine, not because they were frightening, but because they were so unexpectedly profound. Most conversations with hitchhikers involved practical matters, destinations, whether maybe some basic small talk to pass the time. But this young woman was discussing cosmology with the casual ease most people reserved for comments about the weather. "That's a pretty deep way to look at things," I said, finding myself drawn into the conversation despite its unusual nature. "You sound like you've given this a lot of thought." "Time is an illusion," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Past, present, and future are all happening simultaneously. We only experience them sequentially because of the limitations of human consciousness. But from the universe's perspective, everything that ever was or will be exists in the same eternal moment. The way she spoke was mesmerizing, not because of any particular vocal quality, but because of the absolute certainty in her voice. She wasn't speculating or theorizing. She was stating facts as clearly as if she were reading them from a textbook. I found myself completely absorbed in her words, driving almost automatically while my mind grappled with the concepts she was presenting. The miles rolled by unnoticed as she talked about quantum mechanics, about the interconnectedness of all matter and energy, about consciousness as a fundamental property of the universe, rather than something that emerged from complex chemical reactions. "We're approaching the truck stop," I said eventually, noticing the lights of Amarillo appearing on the horizon ahead. I felt almost disappointed that our conversation would soon end. It had been the most intellectually stimulating discussion I'd had in months. "Yes," she said, turning to look at me for the first time since we'd started talking about cosmology. "Thank you for the ride, and thank you for listening." Most people aren't ready to hear these things. "What things?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The truth about what we really are," she said simply. "About what happens when we understand that death is just another illusion, another limitation of human perception. About what it means to truly see the universe as it is." I pulled into the truck stop parking lot, expecting her to gather her things and say goodbye. But when I looked over at the passenger seat, my blood turned to ice. It was empty. No young woman, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Just the lingering scent of something I couldn't identify. Something like ozone after a lightning strike. Something that spoke of vast distances and infinite space. I sat there for a long time, engine running, staring at the empty seat beside me. The conversation had felt so real, so engaging, that I could hardly believe she was gone. But there was no denying the evidence, or rather, the complete lack of evidence that she had ever existed. I climbed down from my cab and walked around to the passenger side, looking for any sign of her presence. The door handle showed no fingerprints, the seat cushion bore no indentation, and there was no trace of another person's scent or warmth. It was as if our entire conversation had been a product of my imagination. But I remembered every word she'd said, every profound insight about the nature of reality and consciousness. The ideas she'd presented were complex and sophisticated, far beyond anything my own mind could have generated spontaneously. Where had those concepts come from, if not from her? Over the following days, I found myself researching the topics she'd discussed: quantum mechanics, cosmology, consciousness studies. To my amazement, many of her seemingly impossible statements turned out to be consistent with cutting-edge scientific theories. Ideas about the nature of time, the interconnectedness of matter and energy, the possibility that consciousness was a fundamental property of the universe. All were being seriously discussed by leading researchers. Was what I experienced some kind of contact with a higher intelligence, a being who understood reality in ways that transcended human limitations? Or was it something even stranger, an encounter with consciousness itself, unbound by physical form, sharing knowledge that exceeded ordinary human understanding? I never saw her again, but I often think about that conversation during my long nights on the highway. Sometimes, when I'm driving under a particularly spectacular, star-filled sky, I find myself remembering her words about cosmic dust and infinite connection. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think I can feel what she meant. The sense that everything really is connected, that we're all part of something much larger and more beautiful than we usually realize. 8. Waystation Ghost. Some places hold on to their history like secrets, and the converted train station that served as our way station on Highway 9 was definitely one of those places. The building had been constructed in 1892 as a major stop on the Great Northern Railway, and you could still feel the weight of all those decades in its weathered brick walls and high arched windows. My father had been working as a way station inspector there for 15 years when he told me about his encounter with the railroad ghost. Dad was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was practical, methodical, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or documented. So when he came home one October evening with a story about seeing a dead man walking the tracks, I knew something significant had happened. It was a foggy night, the kind where visibility drops to almost nothing and sound carries strangely through the thick air. Dad was working the midnight shift, alone in the station as usual, processing the paperwork from the day's truck inspections. The old building creaked and settled around him, making the familiar noises of aged wood and brick adjusting to temperature changes. Around 2 a.m., he decided to step outside for some fresh air and a cigarette. The way station sat right alongside the old railroad tracks, which were still used occasionally for freight trains heading to the grain elevators upstate. In the fog, the rails disappeared into gray nothing in both directions, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. That's when Dad saw the lantern light moving through the mist. At first, he assumed it was a railroad worker doing a late-night track inspection. Not uncommon, though it was unusual for crews to work without radio communication with the station. The light moved slowly along the tracks, swinging back and forth in the methodical pattern of someone checking the rails for damage or obstructions. But as the figure drew closer, Dad began to notice details that made his skin crawl. The man carrying the lantern was dressed in the kind of railroad uniform that hadn't been used for decades. Heavy wool coat, conductor's cap, and boots that belonged to an earlier era of railroading. His movements were oddly fluid, as if he were walking through water rather than on solid ground. The fog seemed to part around the figure, creating a clear corridor of air that made him visible despite the poor visibility everywhere else. Dad could see him clearly, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and the kind of mustache that was popular in the early 1900s. He walked with the confident stride of someone who knew every inch of those tracks, someone who had walked them countless times before. What disturbed Dad most was the man's complete lack of awareness of his surroundings. He didn't acknowledge the way station building, didn't notice Dad standing there watching him, didn't react to the modern trucks parked in the inspection bays. He seemed to exist in his own time, his own reality, following a routine that had nothing to do with the present moment. The figure passed directly in front of the way station, lantern swinging steadily, boots making no sound on the gravel between the railroad ties. Dad called out a greeting, but the man didn't respond. He just continued his methodical journey into the fog, the lantern light growing dimmer until it disappeared entirely into the gray darkness. Dad waited for almost an hour, thinking the railroad worker might return, but the tracks remained empty and silent. The next morning, he called the railroad dispatch office to ask about overnight track inspections. They had no record of any crew working that section of line, and hadn't for several weeks. The incident bothered Dad enough that he mentioned it to some of the older employees at the way station. That's when things got really interesting. It turned out that several people had seen the lantern-carrying figure over the years, always on foggy nights, always following the same route along the tracks. Some described him as the railroad ghost, a spirit left over from the station's days as a busy passenger stop. About a week later, the way station's office manager, Mrs. Henderson, brought in an old photograph she'd found in the building's basement. It was a formal portrait of the railroad crew from 1923. 7 men in uniform posed beside a massive steam locomotive. The photo was labeled with names and job titles, documenting the staff who had worked at the station during its busiest period. Dad took one look at that photograph and felt his blood run cold. There, third from the left in the back row, was the face he'd seen walking the tracks. The nameplate identified him as Edmund Kowalski, night track inspector, 1920 to 1924. Further research revealed that Edmund had died in January of 1924, killed when he slipped on icy rails during a winter storm and was struck by a freight train. According to newspaper accounts, he'd been known for his dedication to safety, often working extra hours to ensure the tracks were clear and safe for the trains that carried passengers and freight through the region. The realization that he'd seen a man who had been dead for over 70 years should have terrified Dad, but instead it gave him a strange sense of peace. Edmund hadn't seemed threatening or malevolent, just dedicated to a job he'd apparently continued long after death. There was something admirable about that kind of commitment, even if it defied every law of physics and logic. Dad worked at that way station for another 5 years before retiring, and he saw Edmund 3 more times, always on foggy nights, always following the same route along the tracks, always carrying his lantern and checking for hazards that might endanger trains that no longer ran passenger service. Other employees reported similar sightings over the years, and Edmund became something of a protective presence at the station. Workers felt safer knowing he was still on duty, still watching over the tracks with the same dedication he'd shown in life. Some even claimed that Edmund's ghost had prevented accidents, alerting modern railroad crews to problems they might have missed. When the way station was finally demolished in 2010 to make way for a modern truck inspection facility, Dad attended the ceremony. As the old brick building came down under the wrecking ball's impact, he thought he saw a brief flicker of lantern light among the falling debris, as if Edmund was saying goodbye to the place that had been his life's work. The new inspection station is efficient and modern, equipped with electronic scales and computerized systems that would have seemed like magic to Edmund Kowalski. But sometimes, on particularly foggy nights, drivers report seeing a faint light moving along the abandoned section of track that still runs behind the facility. Maybe Edmund is still out there, still checking the rails for safety hazards, still dedicated to protecting travelers, even though the trains he once served are now just memories. There's something beautiful about that kind of faithfulness, a reminder that some kinds of service transcend the boundaries between life and death. 9. Arkansas Accident Apparition. There are moments on the highway when you witness something so terrible that it burns itself into your memory forever. What happened on I-40 near Little Rock was one of those experiences, but it came with a twist that still haunts my dreams and challenges everything I thought I knew about life and death. I was hauling auto parts from Memphis to Oklahoma City, making my usual overnight run through Arkansas. It was around 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, and traffic was light. just a few long-haul truckers, and the occasional late-night traveler. The weather was clear, visibility was good, and I was making excellent time on the flat, straight stretch of interstate. That's when I saw the accident unfold in front of me. A pickup truck in the left lane suddenly swerved right, cutting off a sedan that tried to avoid the collision by jerking into the shoulder. But the shoulder was occupied by a motorcycle that had apparently stopped for some reason, and the chain reaction became unavoidable. The sedan clipped the motorcycle, lost control, and rolled multiple times across both lanes of traffic. I hit my brakes and reached for my CB radio simultaneously, knowing that every second counted in a situation like this. Mayday, Mayday. This is Big Dog, eastbound on I-40 at mile marker 153. We have a multi-vehicle fatal accident blocking both lanes. Need emergency services immediately. By the time I got my rig stopped, the scene was horrific. The sedan had come to rest upside down in the median, its roof crushed and windows shattered. The motorcycle was twisted wreckage scattered across the asphalt, and the pickup truck had ended up sideways in the right lane, steam pouring from its radiator. I grabbed my emergency kit and flashlight, knowing from experience that the first few minutes after an accident are crucial for survival. Other trucks were stopping behind me, their hazard lights creating a constellation of amber warning beacons in the darkness. The pickup truck driver was conscious but trapped, his door jammed shut by the impact. "Help's coming," I told him through his partially open window. "Just stay calm and don't try to move." He nodded weakly, blood running from a cut on his forehead. The sedan was a total loss. I could see immediately that no one inside could have survived that kind of impact. The roof was compressed to window level, and there was no sign of movement from within the twisted metal. The motorcycle rider lay motionless, about 30 feet from his bike, clearly beyond help. I was checking the scene for other victims when I noticed him, a man standing near my trailer, about 50 feet from the main wreckage. He appeared to be in his 40s, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans, and he had his hand pressed against his chest as if he was having trouble breathing. But what struck me most was his expression. He looked confused, disoriented, like someone who had just woken up in an unfamiliar place. "Sir," I called out, jogging over to him, "are you hurt? Were you involved in the accident?" As I got closer, I could see that he was pale and sweating, classic signs of shock. His eyes had that unfocused quality that often follows severe trauma. He looked at me with genuine confusion. "What happened?" he asked, his voice shaky and distant. "I was driving home from work, and then, I don't remember. Where am I?" "You've been in an accident," I said gently, pulling out my flashlight to check for obvious injuries. "Can you tell me your name? Do you remember what day it is?" I'd seen this kind of disorientation before. Head injuries could cause temporary amnesia and confusion. "Jim," he said after a moment. "Jim Morrison. I work at the plant in North Little Rock. I was just driving home." He trailed off, looking around at the scene with growing bewilderment. "This doesn't look right. This doesn't look like my route." Emergency vehicles began arriving. First the state troopers, then paramedics and fire trucks. The scene exploded into organized chaos as first responders worked to extract the pickup truck driver and begin their investigation of the fatalities. I guided Jim toward one of the ambulances, figuring the paramedics could check him for injuries and treat his obvious shock. "We have a survivor over here," I called out to one of the EMTs. "Possible head injury, definitely disoriented." But when the paramedic looked in our direction, his expression was puzzled. "Survivor from where?" he asked. We've accounted for all the victims. The motorcycle rider and sedan driver are both DOA, and we're extracting the pickup driver now." I turned to point out Jim, but he was gone, simply vanished, as if he had never been there at all. "There was a man standing right here," I insisted, looking around frantically. Middle-aged guy, plaid shirt, said his name was Jim Morrison. He was confused, probably in shock. The paramedic gave me a concerned look. "Sir, you've just witnessed a traumatic event. Sometimes stress can cause people to see things that aren't there. Why don't you sit down for a minute?" But I knew what I'd seen. Jim had been as real and solid as anyone else at that accident scene. I spent the next hour helping the state troopers with their investigation, giving my statement about how the accident had unfolded. When they were finished with me, I asked the investigating officer about the victims. 3 fatalities, he confirmed grimly. Motorcycle rider, sedan driver, and a passenger in the sedan we initially missed. He consulted his notes. James Morrison, age 44, from North Little Rock, worked at the aluminum plant there. According to his coworkers, he always took this route home from the night shift. My blood turned to ice. "Can you describe him?" I asked, though I already knew what the answer would be. Middle-aged white male, about 5 feet 10, wearing a blue plaid work shirt and jeans. "Why do you ask?" I told him about my encounter with the confused man who had said his name was Jim Morrison, who worked at a plant in North Little Rock, who had been driving home from work. The trooper listened with growing concern, not for my mental state, but because my description was too accurate to dismiss. "That's impossible," he said finally. "Morrison died on impact. The coroner confirmed it. Massive internal injuries. He couldn't have been walking around talking to anyone." But I knew what I'd experienced. Jim Morrison had stood beside my trailer, confused and disoriented, his hand pressed to his chest, where fatal injuries had already claimed his life. He'd been lost, not understanding what had happened to him, still trying to process the transition from life to whatever comes after. I think about that encounter often, especially during my night runs through Arkansas. Was Jim's spirit somehow delayed in leaving his body, giving me a chance to witness that moment of transition? Or was it something more complex, a consciousness that didn't yet realize it no longer needed a physical form? What struck me most was his confusion, his genuine bewilderment at finding himself in an unfamiliar situation. There was nothing frightening about the encounter, just sadness for a man who had been going about his normal routine when fate intervened with devastating finality. I hope Jim found his way to wherever he needed to go. I hope someone was waiting to help him understand and accept what had happened. And I hope that my brief interaction with him, even though he was already gone, provided some small comfort in that moment of ultimate confusion. Sometimes I wonder if other accident victims experience that same delay, that same gradual realization that everything has changed. It makes me more patient with the disoriented survivors I encounter at crash scenes, more understanding of the psychological trauma that accompanies physical injury. Death, it seems, is not always the instantaneous event we imagine. Sometimes it's a process, a transition that takes time to complete. And sometimes, for reasons we may never understand, the living are privileged to witness those final moments of a soul's journey from one state of existence to another.